The wind off the Han River hit like a fist. Cold, brutal, unforgiving. 43 stories above Seoul, the penthouse balcony shuddered under the weight of a single moment. A moment that would not undo itself no matter who screamed, no matter who prayed. Soren Vale's white wedding clothes snapped in the wind as his body struck the railing. Hard. One hand grabbed iron. The other swiped at open air. Below him, the city burned with neon. Reds and blues and cold greens bleeding across the Han River like a wound that never stopped bleeding. He did not scream. He couldn't. The hand that pushed him, steady, deliberate, without a single tremor, belonged to Selim Thorne. Alpha King. Mafia ruler. New husband. Soren's fingers slipped. Selim stood at the railing and watched him fall. The two brothers behind him, Riven and Kaylee's, didn't move at first. Then Kaylee's broke. A sound ripped out of his throat, raw and shattered, and it bounced off every glass surface of that penthouse and disappeared into the Seoul night like smoke. Nobody else screamed. Selim's face didn't change. That was the thing. That was the thing that would burn inside Soren's chest long after the fall. Not the impact. Not the cold air rushing past his ears. Not even the terror ripping through his lungs. It was the look on Selim's face. Not rage. Not panic. Not grief. Calculation. Pure, cold, deliberate calculation like a move in a chess game that had been decided 3 steps earlier. And then the city swallowed Soren whole. Sometimes the most terrifying betrayals don't come from enemies. They come from the people who swore to protect you. The people who stood at an altar with you just hours before. The people whose hands felt safe until they didn't. Nobody warns you about that. Nobody tells you that the person holding you upright on the worst days of your life could also be the person who lets go. Hi viewers, have you ever trusted someone completely, only to have that trust shatter in the single worst moment possible? The sirens started before the echo of the fall did. That was the part nobody noticed at first. The ambulance was already moving, already racing through Seoul's nighttime traffic, lights cutting through the rain-slicked streets below the Thorne Tower. Already coming, as if someone had known, as if someone had called it in advance. 3 seconds after Soren's body disappeared from the balcony's edge, the penthouse glass behind Selim exploded. Not all of it. Just one panel, a precise single-point fracture that sent shards raining inward across the marble floor. A sniper shot. Selim didn't flinch. He turned his back to the city, stepped over the broken glass, and said something quiet to Riven. Too low for the surveillance mics to catch. Too calm for a man who had just pushed his Omega off a 43-story building on their wedding night. And somewhere below, still falling through the cold Seoul air, Soren Vale's eyes stayed open. He was still thinking, still watching, still trying to understand the expression he had seen on Selim's face in that final half-second before the world went vertical. Because mute didn't mean blind. And silence didn't mean empty. The ambulance was close now. The sirens were loud. But as the cold air tore through Soren's wedding clothes and the city rushed up to meet him, one thought moved through him, slow and clean and devastating. Selim had not looked surprised. Not even for a second. 3 months earlier, the elevator in Baiko Tower smelled like stale coffee and someone's ambition. Soren Vale stepped in at the 31st floor, pressed the lobby button, and stood in the back left corner. The same corner every single evening because the security camera had a dead angle there and nobody could watch the back of his neck. Habits like that don't come from nowhere. He was wearing long sleeves. He always wore long sleeves. The financial analytics floor let out at 7:04 p.m. most nights. By 7:05, the hallway was already loud with people celebrating small victories and rehearsing complaints about their supervisors. Soren moved through all of it without touching it. He carried a single canvas bag. He kept his eyes at middle distance. He signed what needed to be signed. He submitted what needed to be submitted. And then he disappeared. His coworkers called him the ghost. Not cruelly, just accurately. He had been at that firm for 14 months. Only 2 people had ever said good morning to him without needing something. One had quit. The other had transferred to the Busan office 3 weeks in. In a system built on presence and noise and the ability to project status across a room, Soren was invisible. He had learned to use that. His desk was in the second row from the back, left side, near the emergency exit. He knew the weight distribution of every floorboard between his workstation and the stairwell. He knew which coworkers stayed late on Thursdays. He knew which security guard took a 9-minute bathroom break at 9:40 p.m. He noticed everything, every pattern, every rhythm, every gap, slim build, quiet presence, eyes that recorded information the same way a security camera does, without editorializing, without judgment, without missing a thing. And beneath the long sleeves, faint lines on his forearms that told a story he had never been asked to share and never offered. His scent was almost undetectable to most people. Almost. Winter rain and cedarwood. Faint enough to be overlooked by standard alphas in a busy room. But to someone with a finely tuned nose, to someone who had spent years learning to read threats and resources in a single breath, it was unmistakable. Rare, actually. The kind of Omega scent that Omega traders spent money to find. Soren didn't know that yet. Not in full. He knew the edges of it, the way certain men looked at him in the subway, then looked away too fast. The way a recruiter at his previous job had asked very specific questions about his health history that had nothing to do with the finance position he had applied for. Small wrong things that he had cataloged and stored and never examined too directly because some truths are easier to carry at a distance. In powerful systems, invisibility can be a prison. You disappear and nobody comes looking. You fall and nobody notices until Monday morning when your workstation sits empty and someone from HR has to come explain. But sometimes invisibility becomes the perfect camouflage. And sometimes it's the only thing keeping you alive. It was a Tuesday evening. Raining. The kind of soul rain that doesn't commit. Just a thin, cold sheet of it that makes the streets look like mirrors. Soren pushed through the Baiko Tower lobby doors, adjusted the canvas bag on his shoulder, and turned right toward the subway station. He got 4 steps. The convoy appeared at the curb without sound. 3 black vehicles. Tinted windows, no plates visible from the street. Not unusual in this part of Seoul. Power moved quietly here. What was unusual was that all 3 vehicles stopped. And then the rear door of the middle car opened. Soren didn't run. He had learned the hard way that running changed the math in ways that rarely ended well. So he stood on the wet sidewalk and watched the man step out. Tall, dark coat, face that Seoul's underground economy had whispered about in varying frequencies for the last 6 years. Sometimes in fear, sometimes in reverence, always with a kind of enforced respect that came not from admiration but from the basic survival instinct of knowing which names you did not say carelessly. Selim Thorne. He stood on the sidewalk and looked directly at Soren. Not past him. Not in his direction. At him. Specifically. Intentionally. Like he had known exactly where to find him. Soren's hand tightened on the canvas bag strap. His pulse stayed controlled. His face stayed neutral. 14 months of invisibility, and this man had still found him. The rain came down between them. Selim stepped forward. Stopped less than 2 feet away, and then slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head slightly and inhaled. 1 breath. The city noise dropped away. His eyes came back up. Dark. Focused. Something moving in them that wasn't aggression and wasn't desire. It was recognition. He said quietly, directly into the rain. You're coming with me. The Thorne Syndicate building didn't announce itself. That was the first thing Soren noted as the convoy turned off the main road and descended into a private underground entrance beneath what appeared, from the outside, to be a standard luxury commercial tower in Gangnam. No signage. No visible security perimeter. Nothing that would attract attention from the street. Which meant all the security was somewhere else. He counted 4 cameras in the parking structure. 2 plainclothes guards at the elevator bank. A weight sensor built into the lobby floor. He felt the slight pause in the elevator's response time that confirmed it had registered exactly how many bodies had entered. The elevator rose 41 floors without stopping. Selim stood beside him and said nothing. That was the second thing Soren noted. Most alphas filled silence. They explained. They warned. They established dominance through language because language was the bluntest tool and it required the least precision. Selim did none of that. He stood still and let the silence do its own work. The penthouse suite that opened on the 41st floor was glass on 3 sides. The Han River bent through the city below like something ancient, lit from every angle by Seoul's relentless glow. The floor was pale stone. The furniture was expensive in the way that expensive things stop advertising themselves. 2 men stood at opposite ends of the room. Same face as Selim's. Same build. Same jaw. Different energy entirely. The one near the window, arms crossed, reading a tablet, looked up with eyes that moved across Soren the way analysts move across financial statements. Looking for inconsistencies. Looking for exposure. Riven Thorn. Intelligence chief. The brother who knew too much about everyone. The one near the kitchen island. Moving, restless, coffee cup already halfway finished. Looked up with a sharper energy. Not hostile. Just kinetic. Like a system that was always running one calculation ahead. Kaylee's Thorn, enforcement commander, the brother whose decisions came fast and landed harder. 3 identical faces. 3 entirely different ways of being in a room. Soren stood near the elevator and watched all 3 of them with the same calm, measured expression he used at the office. Cataloging. Storing. Then something happened that he hadn't expected. Selim stepped closer. Not aggressively, not as a display. Just moved into the same general airspace the way you'd step toward a window to look at the view. And Soren's entire nervous system responded before his mind had time to edit the reaction. Not fear. Not threat response. Something protective moved through Selim's posture. A shift so slight that Riven and Kaylee's probably didn't register it. But Soren caught it. He caught everything. Selim's instincts had reacted. And they had reacted protectively. That confused Soren more than the convoy. More than the scent recognition on the sidewalk. More than being brought here without explanation or apology. Selim Thorn was not supposed to be protective. He was supposed to be strategic. That was the word people used. Every account, every report, every rumored conversation that had filtered through Seoul's underground economy in the last 3 years, strategic. Not protective. Riven set down his tablet. Why bring in Omega here? The question was directed at Selim. Flat. Specific. Not hostile towards Soren. Just demanding clarity from his brother with the efficiency of someone who considered unclear information a liability. Selim answered without looking at Riven. Because someone is hunting him. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Not with raised voices or sudden movement. Just a subtle recalibration. The kind that happens when 3 very intelligent, very dangerous people receive a data point that changes the shape of the problem they're working on. Kaylee's put down his coffee. Riven picked his tablet back up, but his attention wasn't on the screen anymore. Selim turned to Soren and, without ceremony, laid it out. Photographs, financial records, a network map that had taken his intelligence operation 4 months to reconstruct. A trafficking operation targeting rare omegas across Seoul's professional sector. Not street level. Not crude. Embedded. Institutional. Working through employment placement agencies, HR networks, medical screening records. They had been watching Soren for 6 weeks. They had moved twice to collect him. Both times he had disappeared before they reached him. Not because anyone had warned him, but because his own instincts had sent him a different route home without him fully knowing why. Sometimes people think power only protects itself. That the only things worth shielding are the things already inside the fortress. But power also recognizes value. And rare things attract dangerous, patient, well-funded attention. Riven spoke carefully. What's the plan? Selim was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was in the same tone he might use to discuss a change in perimeter security, calm, final, as if the decision had already been made and this was just the announcement. Soren lives here, in the penthouse, under Thorn protection, until the network is dismantled. Riven looked at his brother for a long second. Then he looked at Soren. Then, quietly, he said, "They're going to find out where he is." Living inside a fortress was nothing like what the word safety was supposed to mean. Soren learned that quickly. The penthouse was clean. The food was good. The view of the Han River changed color every hour depending on the light and the weather and the mood of the city below. There was a room for him on the east side. Quiet, separate from the brothers' wing, with a window that faced the direction of the sunrise and let the first light come in without interruption. Everything was fine, and everything was wrong. Riven treated him like a variable in an equation, present, acknowledged, not yet categorized. He asked Soren precise questions in the first few days using a notepad because he had immediately understood the communication barrier. The questions were practical, clinical. What does your daily movement pattern look like? What digital footprint does your employment history leave? Which coworkers know your home address? Soren answered honestly because dishonesty in this house felt like a structural risk. Kaylee's was easier and harder at the same time. He had no patience for silence. Not hostile patience, just the restless energy of someone whose body needed to be doing something at all times. He'd eat standing up. He'd walk the length of the kitchen while talking through syndicate logistics that Soren had no clearance to hear but was apparently trusted enough to overhear. On day 3, he put a cup of tea down next to Soren's notebook without being asked, nodded once, and left. It was one of the stranger acts of kindness Soren had experienced in a long time. Selim was something else entirely. He didn't push. He didn't perform. He didn't seem to need Soren to respond in any particular way. He would come and sit at the same table where Soren worked in the evenings, not close, not far, and read through his own materials in silence. And after the first 3 days, Soren stopped calculating the exit distance from every chair and just worked. That was significant. He had not been able to just work somewhere in a very long time. Took 9 days. On the 9th evening, Selim pulled a chair out across from Soren and set down 2 items, a cup of tea and a single-page document. He didn't explain it immediately. He waited while Soren read it. The document was a protection contract. Formalized. Legal in the sense that syndicate legal structures had their own legitimacy within the world they governed. The terms were specific. The Thorn brothers would guarantee Soren's safety, movement security, and resource access. In exchange, Soren would remain in the penthouse during active threat protocol periods and cooperate with the intelligence operation targeting the trafficking network. Soren read it twice. Then he looked up at Selim. Selim held his gaze for a moment before he said, quietly, "There's a second page." The second page was a marriage contract. Not long, not elaborate. 7 clauses. The language was direct and specific and carried no sentiment. This was an alliance document, written in the same register as every other protection contract in the syndicate's operational history. Marriage to an Alpha King gave an Omega a legal shield that no ordinary protection contract could fully replicate. In Seoul's criminal infrastructure, certain families honored legal bonds where they would not honor protection arrangements. The marriage clause closed the remaining exposure. It was logical. It was cold. It made complete structural sense. Soren sat with it for a while. The city moved below the window. A cargo vessel pushed through the Han River's current, lights trailing in the dark water. Protection often comes with a price. The stronger the fortress, the more enemies gather at the walls. And every wall you build tells the world exactly what's on the other side worth taking. He picked up the pen. He signed both pages. Selim took the documents without ceremony, folded them once, and set them aside. Then he picked up his own tea and went back to reading. Neither of them spoke. The room was quiet in a way that felt different from the silences Soren had lived inside for months. Less like absence. More like 2 people in the same orbit, making separate decisions that had somehow arrived at the same point. 3 floors below, a window cracked. Not broke, cracked. A single thin fracture spreading from the lower left corner of the reinforced glass panel in the building's east stairwell. The security team flagged it at 11:47 p.m. Selim received the notification on his phone without reaction. He read it, set the phone face down, and continued reading. Soren was already asleep by then. He didn't see the notification. He didn't see the bullet hole at the center of the fracture. Precise, deliberate, fired from a building across the river at a range that required planning, patience, and a very specific kind of purpose. But somewhere outside the tower, someone had their rifle scope adjusted and trained on the 41st floor. And they were watching. Word moved the way it always did in Seoul's criminal economy. Quietly, incorrectly, and fast. Within 48 hours of the marriage contract being filed through the syndicate's internal legal structure, 3 separate crime families had received the same rumor. Selim Thorne had taken a mute Omega with no pack, no name recognition, and no known alliances as his formal mate. The reactions varied by family. The Chong Consortium found it amusing. The Hake organization found it suspicious. The Kwan family found it alarming in a way they didn't publicly admit, which meant it was the Kwan family's reaction that mattered most. Selim knew this. He had anticipated all 3 reactions before the ink dried. Wedding preparations became political the moment they became public. A ceremony between the Alpha King of the Thorne Syndicate and any bonded partner was, by the operational rules of Seoul's crime structure, a declaration of territorial stability. It announced succession planning. It announced that the Thorne Empire was not in internal conflict. It announced that the king had chosen. Every crime family in the city read that announcement through the lens of what it meant for their own position. Riven coordinated security protocols across 14 separate threat scenarios. Kaylee's ran 3 dry-run perimeter checks in the 2 weeks before the wedding date. Additional snipers were contracted and positioned at the rooftop of every adjacent structure with a clear sightline to the penthouse. This was not a wedding that felt like a wedding. Felt like what it was. A fortified operation with flowers. Soren moved through the preparations with the same methodical calm he brought to everything. He fitted his wedding clothes without expression. He reviewed security briefings Selim provided via notepad and responded with specific, careful observations that made Riven set down his coffee and look at him differently for the first time. "He's not just an asset," Riven said quietly to Selim the night before the ceremony. Selim didn't respond, but he didn't disagree. The question that Soren turned over in his head during those 2 weeks was not whether Selim would protect him. The man had already demonstrated that. It wasn't whether the marriage was real in the way that marriages were supposed to be real. It wasn't, and Soren was too practical to grieve that. The question was simpler and more dangerous. Why did something in Selim's behavior feel genuine? Not performed. Not strategic. Not the practiced warmth that powerful men deployed as a tool. Something quieter than that. The way he had started leaving a second cup of tea at the table without being asked. The way he sat slightly angled towards Soren in rooms full of people who required his attention. The way his posture shifted at the molecular level whenever someone moved too close to Soren's space. Not possessively, not as a territorial display, but as if some older, more fundamental part of him had made a decision that the rest of him was still processing. Soren had cataloged all of it, stored it, not allowed himself to draw conclusions, because conclusions were a luxury. Love inside violent systems often starts as strategy. The problem with strategy is that it doesn't stay controlled. It finds the cracks in careful people and settles in. And once it's in, pulling it out costs more than leaving it alone. The morning of the wedding, an envelope arrived at the penthouse. No return address. No courier signature. Slid under the door at 6:12 a.m. while the security rotation was mid-shift change, which meant whoever had delivered it understood the Thorne security schedule in specific, dangerous detail. Inside was a single strip of paper. 7 words. No signature. No origin mark. Return the Omega or the war begins. Selim read it once. Folded it once. Handed it to Riven without a word. Riven photographed it, sent the image to 3 different intelligence contacts, and had a preliminary origin analysis running before breakfast was finished. Kaylee's looked at the closed window, at the city outside, at the angle of the morning light across the rooftop across the street. Nobody said the obvious thing. The security protocols doubled by noon. Snipers repositioned. Bodyguard rotations shortened. Selim's movements through the penthouse changed. He started moving through rooms differently, angling himself between windows and where Soren was standing, doing it so naturally that it could have looked accidental. It was not accidental. The ceremony happened at sunset. Short, controlled, witnessed by 12 people, half of whom were armed. The guests left by 9. The city settled into its nighttime frequencies below the balcony. Neon bleeding across the river, the distant sound of traffic 30 stories down, the cold whisper of autumn air coming off the Han. Soren and Selim stood alone on the balcony for the first time since the marriage had been signed. The silence between them was different now. Warmer somehow. More complicated. Like 2 structures that had been built separately and were now trying to figure out if they shared the same foundation. Selim looked out at the river for a long moment. Then he turned slightly, not fully facing Soren, and said quietly, low enough that only the night and the city could hear it, "Stay close to me tonight." The red dot appeared on Selim's chest at 11:23 p.m. Soren saw it first. He was standing 2 feet to Selim's left, holding a folded piece of paper, the thing he had been building the nerve to hand over for the last 4 hours. His eyes caught the laser point the moment it touched the fabric of Selim's jacket. Small, precise, patient. He grabbed Selim's arm. Hard. Selim looked down at the hand, then followed Soren's eyes to his own chest. A half-second passed. Then everything collapsed at once. The floor-to-ceiling balcony glass detonated inward. Not 1 panel. 3. Back to back to back, like something systematic and rehearsed. Like someone had mapped every sheet of glass in this penthouse months in advance and assigned an order. Glass across the stone floor. Cold air flooding in. The sound of it. The shatter, the rush. Loud enough to swallow every other noise in the room for 1 full second. Then the bodyguards were moving. Shouting in Korean. Earpieces live. Weapons drawn. Kaylee's came through the hallway entrance at a run. Already low. Already reading the room with the speed of someone who had rehearsed exactly this scenario. He got to the wall to the left of the window frame and pressed flat. Riven was already on comms. 3 words, clipped, operational, calling in the rooftop team. Selim had not moved toward the exit. He was standing still, reading the room the same way he read every room. Not with panic, but with the cold efficiency of someone calculating outcomes faster than most people could form sentences. Soren pushed the folded paper into Selim's hand. Because it couldn't wait anymore. Selim unfolded it. Read it in the strobing chaos of the emergency lights that had kicked on when the glass went. His eyes moved across the page once. Then he looked at Soren. Pause on that, because what Soren had written on that page changed the shape of the entire night. The trafficking network had not selected Soren randomly. They had not identified him through an employment database or a medical record or any of the institutional channels Riven's intelligence team had mapped. They had planted him. Long before Soren understood what was happening to him, the network had positioned him inside Baiko Tower's financial analytics floor with a specific purpose: to gain proximity to the Thorn Syndicate's financial infrastructure. Soren had been accessing Thorn-adjacent accounts for 14 months without knowing what he was touching or why he had been placed there to touch it. He was never the target. He was the key. Selim read it a second time. 1 more sniper shot came through the open balcony frame and punched into the far wall. Not at head level. Lower. Deliberately low. Warning shot. Or a calibration round. This matters. The angle of it meant the shooter wasn't trying to kill anyone yet. They were establishing a perimeter, keeping everyone away from the exits that faced the river. Selim folded the paper. His jaw tightened for exactly 1 second. Then he looked at Soren with that expression, the one Soren would not understand until tomorrow, and reached for him. Kaylee saw it happening from across the room and his face changed. Selim. Selim's grip on Soren's shoulder was firm, deliberate, not angry, not panicked. And then it shifted, both hands a half turn, a single motion that happened fast enough that the bodyguards at the door didn't process it until it was already done. Soren went over the balcony railing. The city rushed up. The wind came in hard off the Han River, and for 3 full seconds the world was only cold air and neon light and the sound of Seoul below, distant and indifferent and blazing with the same energy it always had, regardless of what fell through it. And somewhere above, the penthouse erupted. Gunfire now. Real gunfire. Not warning shots, the disciplined, rapid exchange of a close-range assault. Glass on stone. Boots moving fast. Kaylee's voice cutting through the noise. Commanding, directional. The voice of a man who had been built for exactly this kind of moment. The city kept burning below. Soren kept falling. And then, 5 floors down, the maintenance platform caught him. He hit its shoulder first. Hard enough to knock the air out. Hard enough to send sparks of white across his vision. The metal structure groaned once under the impact but held. Safety cables. Industrial brackets. Load rated for far more than one person's weight. Calculated. Everything in him went quiet. Not from the impact. From understanding. This was planned. The platform. The angle of the fall. The exact distance from the balcony rail. Someone had measured this. Someone had placed him on this side of the railing at this angle at this moment. Not because it was the only option available. Because it was the safest landing that could be engineered. Above him, the gunfight continued. And somewhere in the noise and the smoke and the broken glass, Selim Thorne was still standing. Time does a strange thing when your body is processing shock. It doesn't stop. It stretches. Soren lay on the maintenance platform and counted, because counting was something he could control, and control was the only thing keeping his body from shutting down. 1, 2, 3. The metal under him was cold. His shoulder was screaming. The sky above Seoul was the color of burnt orange where the city lights met the clouds, and somewhere above that color, 43 stories up, the penthouse was at war. He could hear it. Not the specific sounds, just the shape of it. The percussion of it. The way it rose and fell. He pressed himself flat and breathed. Sometimes survival requires choices that look like betrayal from the outside. That's the part nobody talks about. When someone you trust puts you in danger to save you, the mind can't immediately separate the act from the feeling. All it registers is the hands. The push. The fall. The space that opened up between you and the person you thought was going to stand next to you. The grief of that hits before the logic does. Every time. Soren turned his head carefully and looked out at the city. The Han River moved in the distance, patient and indifferent. A cargo vessel was crossing under the Mapo Bridge, its deck lights cutting a slow path through the dark water. Normal. Continuous. Unbothered. Then helicopters. Not 1. 3. They came in from the northwest, low and fast, navigation lights blinking in irregular patterns. Not police. Not media. Private craft, moving in formation with the kind of coordinated intent that said someone had called them in on a prearranged signal. That matters, because it meant this wasn't improvised. The evacuation plan had been in place before the ceremony started. Before the first sniper shot hit the glass. Before any of it began publicly. A rope line dropped from the nearest helicopter to the rooftop 2 structures over. Fast roping. Black tactical gear. For people down the line in under 8 seconds. Emergency response team. Not city emergency. Private. Thorne contracted. Which meant Selim had not just planned for Soren to survive the fall. He had planned for what came after it. Above, the gunfight peaked. Rapid exchanges, the kind that meant 2 sides occupying the same room. Then 3 controlled bursts, a pause and silence. The kind of silence that comes after a fight ends. Not gradually. All at once. Soren was already sitting up on the platform by the time the service elevator shaft to his left activated. The door opened. 2 paramedics in civilian clothes. One wheeled stretcher. One medical bag. Already moving with the efficiency of people who had been briefed and staged before the event began. Soren let them work. He sat on the stretcher and looked at the city and let his hands be checked and his shoulder assessed and a blood pressure cuff wrapped around his arm. He looked at the light on the Han River. He thought about the paper he had put in Selim's hand. The paramedic said something to him in Korean. Then in English. Can you tell me your name? He pointed to his throat. Right. The paramedic made a note. We'll work around it. They were already moving him toward the service elevator when the second operative crouched beside him and said something quietly. Not loudly, not for anyone else to hear, leaning in close in the way of someone delivering a message rather than medical information. Low voice. Steady. They weren't aiming for the king. Soren looked at him. The entire operation tonight. Pause. They were aiming for you. The elevator door closed. The city disappeared. And in the space of 4 floors of downward movement, the slow, mechanical descent through the body of a building that had just survived a war, Soren sat with that information and turned it over the way he turned over every dangerous piece of data. Not aiming for the king, aiming for him. Which changed everything about who had called this in, who had planned the assault, and why a trafficking network that operated with institutional patience and financial precision had chosen tonight, the wedding night, as the moment to move. Not to remove Selim, to retrieve Soren, because he wasn't just a key anymore. He knew too much about what he had been doing for 14 months. He had seen the accounts. He had touched the data. He had processed transactions that connected the trafficking network to financial structures that none of their accountants could now disavow. He was the only living evidence. The elevator reached the lobby level. The stretcher wheels hit concrete. The sirens outside were already close. And somewhere above, in the wreckage of a penthouse that had been built like a fortress and had still been breached, Selim Thorne was either standing or he wasn't. Soren didn't breathe again until the ambulance doors closed around him. The ambulance moved through Seoul like it owned the city, which at that moment it kind of did. 3 police convoys flanked it, 2 ahead, 1 behind, lights cutting through every intersection. The city parting around them with the resigned compliance of a place that had seen too many emergencies to treat any of them as extraordinary. The Han River flashed in the windows to the left. Then it disappeared. Then buildings closed in on both sides and the ambulance was threading through Mapogu at a speed that left no room for hesitation. Soren lay strapped to the stretcher and watched the ceiling. The paramedic on his left was monitoring his vitals with the quiet precision of someone very good at their job. Blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen. Every 30 seconds, a glance at the numbers, a small adjustment, a note in a tablet. The shoulder hurt. He documented that internally. Tissue damage. Likely a partial separation. Manageable without surgery if immobilized quickly. Nothing that wouldn't heal. His mind was already somewhere else. It was working through the sequence. The paper he had handed Selim. The red laser. The 3 panels of glass. The fall. The platform. The operative's words in the service elevator. They were aiming for you. Outside, Seoul moved fast and indifferent past the ambulance windows. Media helicopters had found the Thorne Tower by now. He could see their lights in the upper left window, circling at a respectful and thoroughly useless distance from whatever crime scene investigators were going to find on the 41st floor. The reports would say home invasion, or rival gang conflict, or something that satisfied the city's need for a clean category. They would not say what it actually was. The ambulance pulled into Severance Hospital's restricted trauma bay. Not the public entrance. The side entrance, the one that the city's powerful and the city's compromised both used, for opposite reasons, and both preferred kept quiet. Doors open. Stretcher moving. Fluorescent lights overhead now instead of city glow, and the particular smell of a hospital. Antiseptic and rubber and the faint, unmistakable undercurrent of fear that no amount of cleaning product ever fully eliminated. Soren was moved to a private room within 4 minutes. Not standard triage. Prearranged. A doctor came in and spoke to him in careful English, which meant someone had briefed the staff about the communication situation in advance. She examined his shoulder, ordered imaging, confirmed the partial separation diagnosis with a quiet efficiency that made him trust her immediately. She also checked his wrists and forearms without commenting on what she found there, which meant she had been specifically instructed not to. That level of preparation did not happen spontaneously. Someone had been running 2 operations simultaneously tonight, the defense of the penthouse and the protection of Soren afterward. Both with equal precision. Both pre-planned. Destiny isn't always about finding love. Sometimes it's about surviving the war that comes with it. And sometimes the war is already 3 steps ahead of you before you know it started. He was sitting up in the hospital bed, shoulder immobilized, reading the news reports on a tablet the staff had left him. Watching the media try to construct a narrative from thermal footage of Thorn Tower and police scanner audio, when the first concrete information arrived. Not from the TV. From the nurse who stepped in to check his 4-line and quietly set a folded slip of paper on the bedside table. Same format as the message that had arrived at the penthouse that morning. No name, no signature, just a sentence. He read it. The attackers were confirmed mercenaries. Contracted through a shell company with registered ties to 3 separate crime consortiums operating in Seoul's outer districts. The consortium had spent 8 months building the operation. The wedding date had been chosen specifically because it concentrated Thorn security resources on a single location and created a public event trail that would make any defensive countermeasure look like aggression. It was sophisticated. It was well-funded. And it had still failed. Soren set the paper down. He looked at the door. He thought about the calculation on Selim's face in that last half-second before the fall. The thing he had read as cold and removed and devastating. The thing he had carried all the way down 43 stories as the worst kind of evidence. He was reconsidering it. He was reconsidering all of it. The door to the room burst open. Not gently. Not procedurally. It came open the way doors open when someone has been moving at full speed for a long time and does not have patience for handles. Selim Thorn stood in the doorframe. Dark coat. Split lip. A gash above his left eye that had been closed with medical tape and was bleeding through it. The kind of bruising across his right hand that came from impact with another person's face at speed. Alive. Standing. His eyes found Soren immediately, and the expression on his face, for the first time since Soren had known him, was not calculated. It was just relief, raw, unguarded, fully visible, like a man who had run through a war to get to a room and had arrived terrified of what he might find. Selim crossed the room in 4 steps and stopped at the edge of the bed. He didn't reach for Soren. He just stood there, chest still moving hard from exertion, blood from the cut above his eye working its way past the medical tape, and looked at him the way you look at something you were not certain you would see again. For seconds of that. Then he pulled the chair from the corner, sat down beside the bed, and put his hands on his knees. "You're okay," he said. It wasn't a question. It was something he was saying out loud to confirm it for himself. Soren watched him. He picked up the notepad from the bedside table. The staff had left it there, thoughtful or briefed, and wrote 2 words. He turned the pad toward Selim. "Tell me." Selim looked at the words. Then he looked at Soren for a long moment. Then he began. The trafficking consortium had been trying to reach the Thorn Syndicate's financial architecture for 3 years. Not to steal from it, to own a piece of it. To plant a route inside the syndicate's transaction network that they could use to move money invisibly, laundering operational funds through Thorn-adjacent accounts in a way that would make the syndicate, not the consortium, appear liable to any investigation. Soren had been positioned inside Baiko Tower 14 months ago as the mechanism for that access. He hadn't been recruited, he had been engineered into the role. His employment record had been altered by the network before he ever applied. The accounts he had been processing were specifically structured to pull him deeper into Thorn-adjacent financial territory with each passing quarter. He had been a tool without knowing he was being held. Selim paused. "When I found you on that sidewalk, I already knew most of this. My intelligence operation had been tracking the network's movements for months. We had identified the financial route. We had traced it back to Baiko Tower. He looked at his hands. What I didn't know was what you were. That lands. Pause on it. Because what Selim said next had nothing operational in it. My instincts told me before my analysis did. The moment I stood near you, something in me reacted that I couldn't explain through strategy or threat assessment or any framework I had built over a decade of running this organization. He looked up. You weren't the exposure. You were never the liability. The network thought they were using you as a key. But you are a scent-bonded match. Something that specific, that rare, doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen because a trafficking network positioned you correctly. That part was already written before any of them touched you. Soren sat with that. He wrote something on the notepad. The wedding. Was any of it real? Selim read it. A silence came that was different from the silence he usually carried, less controlled, more honest. The protection was real from the beginning, he said. The marriage clause was the most efficient legal solution. That was true. Another pause. The rest of it became real. I don't know exactly when. I noticed it and kept it at a distance because Alpha Kings don't build strategy around personal feeling. Feeling is a variable that other people exploit. He looked directly at Soren. I stopped caring about that sometime around day 9. Day 9. The contract. The silence at the table that had felt like two structures finding the same foundation. Some questions carry more weight than any confession. And some confessions arrive too late for the person who needed them earlier. That's not tragedy. That's just the way truth moves inside people who have learned to protect themselves from it. Soren looked at Selim for a long time. Then he reached forward and closed his hand around Selim's wrist. Selim went still. Soren's throat worked. He hadn't tried to speak in months. Not since the incident that had taken the sound from him. The one that lived beneath the long sleeves and behind the careful eyes and inside the corner of every room he had ever stood in. He tried. It didn't come easily. It came like something moving through old scar tissue. Slow, painful, uncertain. But it came. A single word. Barely more than a breath. Rough at the edges and completely unambiguous. Why? Selim heard it. He looked at Soren like he'd just watched something impossible become real in real time. Then he leaned forward. Quietly. Close. Because you're mine, he said. Not by claim. Not by contract. By something I don't have a strategic framework for. He paused. And I am not sorry for any of it. The room was quiet. Outside, Seoul moved through its night unbothered. Traffic and rain and neon and the Han River carrying everything south toward the sea. Then, from somewhere down the hospital corridor, glass shattered. Then running. Then the unmistakable sound of a security door taking impact from the wrong side. Selim was on his feet before the echo finished. They came through the service corridor. 4 of them. Moving fast, dressed in hospital staff uniforms that didn't belong on bodies built like that. Holding the kind of posture that belongs to men who have run assaults before and don't slow down at the hard parts. The first one hit the hallway at the same moment Kaylee's came through the stairwell door at the far end. Kaylee's had been running. He hadn't stopped running since the penthouse. He hit the first operative before the man could raise his weapon. Shoulder first, full momentum, the kind of impact that doesn't ask permission, and they went into the wall together hard enough to crack the drywall. The second operative turned toward the noise and caught Riven coming from the opposite direction. Riven moved differently from Kaylee's. Where Kaylee's was impact, Riven was sequence. 3 moves that connected so fast they appeared to be one, efficient and cold and completely without wasted motion. The hallway was not designed for this. Neither was the hospital. But the Thorn brothers had not been designed for comfort either. Selim stood in the doorway of Soren's room with his back to the corridor, facing inward. Not facing the fight, facing Soren. That was the choice. Right there. In the middle of the loudest, most operationally urgent moment of the night, with his brothers working through 4 trained operatives in a hospital hallway 20 feet behind him. Selim Thorn turned his back on the fight and stood between the door and the man in the bed. Not running toward the conflict. Not deploying. Guarding the one thing he had decided was worth guarding. Real power isn't winning every fight. It's choosing which fights deserve your back. And it's knowing in the specific, irreversible moment of choosing which direction to face. The hallway noise peaked, then dropped, then went quiet in that same way all at once. That meant it was over. Kaylee's voice, clear. Then Riven, for down. Ambulatory. Police are 90 seconds out. Selim didn't move from the doorway for another full 10 seconds. Then he stepped back into the room and pulled his phone and made a call that lasted 45 seconds. Quiet. Direct. The kind of call that activated systems and set processes in motion that most people never knew existed. When he ended it, he looked at Soren and said, "It's done." But it wasn't done the way war ends. It was done the way Selim had decided to end it. Not by escalating. Not by sending a response force to the consortium's operations. Not by turning the next 3 months into a retaliatory campaign that would leave bodies across 4 districts and give every crime family in sole reason to choose a side. He had spent 40 minutes after the penthouse assault forwarding evidence. Financial records, transaction trails, network maps, the full operational documentation that Riven's intelligence team had built over 4 months. Names, accounts, shell companies, the 14-month financial operation that had run through Baiko Tower and touched Soren's hands and connected back to 3 separate crime consortiums with verifiable money trails. He had sent it to authorities. Not police, the prosecutors with the clearance and the mandate and the distinct interest in making an example of organized crime that had reached into legitimate financial infrastructure. He had handed them everything. Ended it politically. Because the war was never going to end through violence. Violence would just reshape it, give it new leaders and new motivations and new reasons to come back around. Evidence ended it. Evidence named people and froze accounts and triggered international asset recovery protocols that made running considerably less attractive than negotiating. That matters. It was the smartest thing Selim Thorne had ever done. And it cost him every piece of leverage he had spent 3 years collecting. He sat down beside the bed. Soren looked at him for a long time, then wrote on the notepad, "You gave it all up." Selim read it. "Yes." Soren wrote again. "For what?" Selim looked at the words, then at Soren, then out at the window, the sole night outside, still running, still loud, still burning with all its indifferent brilliance. "For what comes after," he said. 3 months later, a different penthouse. Quieter. Lower floor. The Han River visible from the east window in the mornings when the light came in clean and the city hadn't fully started yet. Soren lived there. Healing. Not quickly. Not all at once. But steadily. The shoulder fully recovered by week 6. The sessions with a specialist, someone who understood what lived beneath long sleeves, began in week 4 and continued twice a week through the month. Slow work. Honest work. The kind that doesn't have a finish line so much as a direction. He worked from the penthouse. Legitimate work now. A financial analysis consultancy that Riven had quietly established in his name, staffed with 2 people who asked no questions and delivered good results. He had his own table, his own corner, his own cup of tea. Some nights Selim was there. Most nights he was not. The restructuring of the syndicate after the evidence disclosure was a full-time exercise in survival, the kind of institutional rebuilding that didn't allow for consistent schedules. But he came, always came back. One evening, a Thursday, the city reigning in that thin, non-committal soul way. Soren was sitting at the table when Selim came in and set down his coat and didn't speak, just sat. The silence settled. Familiar now, not empty. After a long time, Soren turned toward the window and watched the rain move across the glass. And then, slowly, carefully, like someone testing weight on a healing bone, he spoke. Not a whisper this time. A full word. One. Selim. It landed in the room like something that had been looking for that exact place to rest. Selim went still, then turned, looked at him. A long moment passed before he spoke. "You survived the fall," he said. He said it softly. The way you say something that means more than itself. Then, after a pause that held the full weight of everything that had come before it. But destiny hasn't finished with us yet. The rain came down, the city burned on, and the Han River kept moving south, always south, carrying everything quietly toward wherever it was all going next. If the story moved you, share it. Put it in the comments. Tell someone who needs to hear that survival isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of the one worth telling. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story coming to this channel. Stories about strength, about choices made in impossible moments, about the kind of love that doesn't arrive gently, the kind that fights its way through. We'll see you in the next one.